move the cat. Bex Harrington had worked the back office of Aurelio's for 3 years and had learned, early and permanently, that there were exactly 2 kinds of requests in this building. The kind you could say no to, and the kind you couldn't. This one sat somewhere she'd never encountered before. Ghost, a white Persian cat the approximate size and weight of a sandbag, had appeared in the back office 40 minutes ago. One of the line cooks had found her in the alley behind the kitchen and, not wanting to explain to management why a stray cat had died near the walk-in freezer, had quietly relocated her inside. Ghost had inspected every corner of the office with the thoroughness of a building inspector, sniffed 3 of the 4 walls, and then climbed onto Bex's lap and gone to sleep. That was 40 minutes ago. Now 4 men in dark suits filled the doorway. Behind them stood a 5th man who didn't need a suit to communicate that he ran the room. Raphael Neri was 43 years old, controlled the most significant criminal organization on the eastern seaboard, and owned the cat currently pinning Bex's keyboard out of reach. "I'm trying," Bex said. She was. Ghost had the dense, immovable quality of something that had decided. Bex slid one hand beneath the cat's middle. Ghost pressed 40 pounds of Persian indifference deeper into her thighs and purred louder. Neri looked at Ghost. Ghost did not look at him. The silence stretched. One of his men shifted. That was the only sound. Bex had seen Neri exactly twice before, once through a window when his car arrived for a quarterly meeting she wasn't invited to, and once at a distance when she'd mistaken him for the restaurant inspector and spent 10 frantic minutes rehearsing an explanation for a second quarter inventory gap. She hadn't been close enough either time to notice that his eyes, when they settled on something, had the quality of a man measuring a distance he intended to close. They were settling on her now. "She doesn't do this," he said. "I believe you." Bex looked down at Ghost. "She's doing it anyway." "She doesn't sit on people." "She's sitting on me." From the doorway, one of the men appeared to inhale too sharply. Everyone pretended they hadn't heard it. Neri stepped into the office. He crouched beside her chair, a measured, unhurried movement, the kind that communicated he had not once in his adult life been in a hurry, and held his hand near Ghost's face, a greeting, not a command. Ghost opened one golden eye. She assessed him. She closed the eye again. Bex pressed her lips together very hard. "Don't," Neri said. "I didn't say anything." "You were thinking something." She had been. She decided not to confirm it. "She's not ignoring you. She's comfortable. If you move her now, she'll dig in, and I think we'd both prefer she didn't." He looked at her with an expression that could have meant several things. "You're telling me how to handle my cat." "I'm telling you what your cat is telling me." She kept her voice level. "She found somewhere warm. It's almost midnight. She's done." He looked at Ghost. A long, careful look. The kind a man gives when he's accustomed to problems having solutions, and this particular problem is not behaving like one. "She escaped from my driver," he said finally. He didn't realize she'd followed him out of the garage. "How far did she walk?" 6 blocks. Bex looked down at the cat snoring on her thighs. "She walked 6 blocks in November and chose my lap." Apparently. Something in her chest did a small, unwelcome thing. She ignored it. "Give her 20 minutes. She'll move on her own." Neri studied her for a moment. Then he stood. 20 minutes. He said it like he was granting a concession to a foreign government. Bex decided that was fine. Ghost woke up in 14. She stretched with full theatrical commitment. All 4 legs, a yawn the size of an editorial opinion, then stepped off Bex's lap with the deliberate dignity of someone who had never been rushed in her life. She crossed the floor to Neri, sat beside his shoe, and looked up at him. He looked down at her. The thing in his face at that moment was not the controlled expression he'd worn since he walked through the door. Bex caught it and said nothing. He picked Ghost up. She tucked her face against his jacket immediately, like she'd been waiting. He was already turning toward the door when he stopped. "You're the bookkeeper." "Financial director," Bex said, "and community programs lead." Something registered behind his eyes. He noted the correction, Bex Harrington. She hadn't told him her name, which meant he'd already known it, which meant she needed a quiet moment later to think about what that implied. Yes. His gaze moved to the spreadsheets on her monitor. It was 2 minutes to midnight. "You're here late. End of month reconciliation." He nodded once, as if filing that somewhere specific. Then he left. Ghost looked back at Bex from over his shoulder. Bex looked back. She told herself it was nothing. Ghost had been cold. Her lap had been warm. It didn't mean anything, and Raphael Neri had a city to manage, and she had 47 line items left before she could go home. She was wrong about it being nothing. 2 days later, one of Neri's men appeared in the back office, with Ghost in a carrier, and a message that Mr. Neri was concerned the cat wasn't eating, and would appreciate Bex's assessment, since she had apparently made an impression. Bex opened the carrier. Ghost stepped out, inspected the office with the same systematic thoroughness as before, and then looked pointedly at the desk drawer where Bex kept plain chicken strips for the days she forgot lunch. Bex opened the drawer. Ghost ate 4 strips in quick succession. She sent a message back with the man. "Behavioral assessment. The cat is fine. She is managing her owner." She assumed that was the end of it. Neri came himself the next time. He walked into the back office at 10 in the evening, Ghost under one arm, looking precisely as composed as a man who had not just carried a Persian cat through a commercial kitchen while 2 line cooks tried not to make eye contact. "She won't sleep," he said. Bex looked up from her monitor. "What does her bed smell like?" A pause. "It's orthopedic, custom-made." "That's not what I asked." Another pause, longer. "It was cleaned this week." She nodded slowly. "Her bed smells wrong. She's not unsettled. She's annoyed." She stood, moved to the small couch along the far wall, and patted the cushion. Ghost landed on it immediately, circled twice, pressed her face into the blanket's edge, and in 30 seconds was asleep. Neri stared at her. He had the look of a man who had never once encountered a problem that cost this little to solve. "You knew immediately," he said. "Cats don't like change. Anything new in her environment she'll protest. Was anything else cleaned recently? A car, a chair she uses?" He considered this, the car. "There's your answer." He stayed. He didn't announce that he was staying. He simply remained, standing near the window, where he could see both the door and its reflection, answering 3 phone calls in a voice too quiet to make out, moving through the silence of the office, with a stillness that was somehow not absence. Once, he looked at her monitor and said, "There's a duplication in column F." There was. She'd been staring at the same 4 rows for 20 minutes and missed it entirely. He didn't mention that he'd caught it. She didn't mention that she was impressed. They continued in silence until midnight, when he collected Ghost and left. He came back. He always had a reason. Ghost was scratching the furniture. Ghost had developed a fixation with a particular corner of the penthouse that Neri described with the careful language of a man who didn't want to admit he'd rearranged furniture around it. Ghost seemed restless. Ghost kept sitting by the front door in a way that suggested she had somewhere to be. Bex addressed each reason with the same unhurried certainty she applied to everything. Ghost was always perfectly fine in the back office, comfortable, well-fed, asleep. Neri always stayed longer than the reason required. Aurelio's had a sommelier named Cal Sullivan, who had worked there for 4 years, and who brought Bex a glass of whatever he was opening at the end of his shift. He knew she took her coffee with oat milk. He knew she skipped lunch on Wednesdays when the delivery ran late. He was easy company and asked nothing complicated. Neri noticed Cal on the fourth visit. Cal had come in with 2 glasses and a Barbera, spent 15 comfortable minutes with Bex going over a table that had left an unusual tip, and left. The room became slightly more interesting after that. "How long has Sullivan worked here?" Neri asked. 4 years. "He brings you wine." "He brings everyone wine. He's a sommelier." "He poured you a better glass than his own." She paused. She hadn't noticed that. The fact that Neri had cataloguing the poor levels of a sommelier while conducting a conversation about a cat said something precise about the quality of his attention, and she wasn't entirely sure what to do with that information. "He's a colleague. He knows how you take your coffee." People who work together for 4 years tend to know that. Neri considered this with the expression of someone reviewing it for structural weaknesses. Then he looked at Ghost, who was asleep on the couch with all 4 paws pointed at the ceiling and her chin at an anatomically improbable angle. Something flickered at the edge of his expression. Not quite a smile, something adjacent. Bex looked away first. 2 weeks later, Cal appeared in the office with 2 coffees and a question about a supplier contract. While they went over the numbers, Ghost woke up, greeted Cal with the moderate enthusiasm she reserved for people who had once been kind to her, and returned to the couch. Neri happened to be standing near the window. He watched the greeting without comment. After Cal left, he said nothing for almost 3 minutes. Then, "He brings you coffee." Bex kept her eyes on her screen. "You're thinking very loudly." "A beat. That's my line." She smiled at her monitor. She didn't tell him that Cal's interest in her was mild and reciprocally uncomplicated, that he would be entirely fine with any outcome. There was no reason to tell him that. Neri had absolutely no reason to care. But she noticed that the following week, a delivery arrived at the restaurant. Not for any event she'd scheduled. Not from any supplier she recognized. 3 containers from the best Japanese restaurant in the city, labeled with her name in handwriting that was not Cal's. She ate the food. She said nothing. Ghost ate a piece of salmon. Neri looked at the window. The invitation arrived at the end of the month. Aurelio's had been named a hospitality partner for the city's Culinary Heritage Foundation. The gala was the kind of event Bex was not naturally inclined to attend. Donor-heavy, status-conscious. A room full of people who communicated value through what they wore and who they stood near. But Aurelio's community kitchen had fed 312 people last winter. That had her name on it. She went. Neri was already there when she arrived, which made sense because this was his world. Polished rooms, careful money, power moving, quietly in expensive clothes. He saw her from across the room. She didn't go to him. A woman named Celeste Armand found her within 10 minutes. Celeste was connected to several of Neri's charitable foundations and wore this connection the way some people wore jewelry, as a signal of belonging. "You're the bookkeeper," Celeste said pleasantly. "From Aurelio's." "I'm the financial director," Beck said just as pleasantly. "I also run the community programs." "Of course," a gracious smile. "I hear you've gotten to know Raphael quite well." There was a quality to how she said it. Light, easy, impossible to object to without seeming defensive. That made Bex into an accessory. The technique worked by suggesting your presence in a room required an explanation, and the explanation was someone else. It happened 4 times over the course of the evening. Each time, Bex's work disappeared. The 300 families last winter disappeared. The budget she'd built from $11,000 and a community partnership that took 2 years to establish, gone. What remained was a woman who had found her way into Raphael Neri's orbit and therefore rated an introduction at all. The 4th time, Celeste was standing with a small cluster of donors. "It's funny," she said, to no one specifically, to everyone. The fastest way into certain rooms lately seems simpler than we've all made it. A smile, light, gracious. A couple of polite laughs followed, the kind people produce when they don't want to be the one who didn't laugh. The heat that moved under Bex's skin was specific. She'd felt it before, the temperature of being reduced while everyone around her kept their faces pleasantly arranged. She looked at Celeste. Aurelio's community kitchen served 312 people last winter, she said. Her voice was even. We partnered with 4 shelters, ran it on $11,000, and were the only hospitality program in the city offering fresh-cooked meals. Not packaged through the coldest month on record. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. I built that program. That's why I was invited. The laughter was gone. She turned back to the bar. She didn't hear him come up behind her. She only knew Neri was there when the room's atmosphere rearranged itself, the way it always did around him. You handled it, he said quietly. I did. Silence. Then she's done this before, not the first time tonight. I know. He was still for a moment. She thought he'd let it go. Instead, he crossed the room, and she watched a brief conversation take place between him and the Foundation's director. Whatever he said, the director's expression moved from polite attention to something more corrective. When the partnership awards were announced, the director said, Bex Harrington, financial director and community programs lead at Aurelio's, whose kitchen fed over 300 families last winter, and whose work is exactly what this foundation exists to support. Applause. Bex stood and received it. She found Neri afterward near the room's edge. You didn't have to, she said. Yes, I did. I'd already handled it. I know you did. He met her eyes. I addressed something different. She understood the line he'd drawn. She'd spoken for herself. He'd spoken for the record. Those weren't the same action, and he'd known better than to make them one. You could have embarrassed her, she said. I considered it. You could have made it considerably worse for her. I frequently consider that. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Restrained, almost nothing. I asked a question instead. She laughed before she could stop herself. But on the way home, the laugh faded into something quieter. His world had changed the meaning of things tonight. The way the room received her, the correction that followed, the applause. He hadn't invented her work, but standing near it had given it different weight. That was not a small thing. She needed to sit with that. A week after the dinner, Ghost was asleep on the couch, and Neri was at the window. And Bex said what she'd been thinking. She doesn't need to keep coming here. He looked up. She's better, Bex said. She's sleeping. She's eating. Whatever was unsettling her is past. She kept her hands still on the desk. There's no professional reason to bring her back. He went very still. No professional reason, he repeated, putting the weight exactly where she'd put it. No. He didn't argue. He didn't produce an emergency. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, understood, and called Ghost. And Ghost, with the golden-eyed knowledge of a creature who had seen things coming before the humans in the room, walked to the carrier and climbed in. At the door, Neri paused, said nothing, left. He didn't come back. Not the next day or the day after. A week passed. The back office returned to its ordinary state. The refrigeration hum below, the muffled kitchen noise through the walls, the monitor's blue light at 11 p.m. when the numbers needed someone to sit with them. Bex found she didn't like ordinary anymore. She missed the weight of Ghost against her ankle. She missed the specific quality of Neri occupying a room. Fully present, never pretending, never restless. She missed the quietly absurd comedy of the most feared man in the city, waiting for a Persian cat to finish a nap before he could have his evening back. She had wanted to know her life was still hers. Now she knew. Everything was exactly where she'd left it. Her work was unchanged. Her name belonged to her. Nothing had been taken. But something was missing, and she'd put it there herself. And she couldn't decide if that was discipline or a mistake. Across the city, Raphael Neri had a simpler problem, and was handling it considerably worse. Ghost was fine. She ate, slept, reclaimed her window chair. She was completely, undeniably well. That was the problem. For 3 weeks, Neri reviewed what he had done. He had gone back to Aurelio's because his cat was different there. He had stayed while Ghost slept on a couch that wasn't his. He had noted a sommelier's pour levels, sent food with no reasonable explanation, caught a spreadsheet error he had no business reading, and stood at a charity dinner asking himself questions that had one answer he kept refusing to write down. None of it had been about the cat. He had understood this for approximately 3 weeks. He had spent those same 3 weeks looking for a more structurally defensible version of the truth, something with logic he could point to, something that didn't require him to admit what it actually was. There wasn't one. On a Thursday evening, he left Ghost at home, told his driver to take him to Aurelio's, and walked through the kitchen entrance alone. Bex looked up when the door opened. Her eyes went immediately to the space at his side. Where's Ghost? Home. She straightened. Is she all right? She's fine, asleep on the chair. He stepped inside. I checked before I left. Then why? She stopped. She looked at him. He looked back. For a man who had walked into rooms with weapons pointed at him and walked out again, with nothing more visibly disturbed than a slight adjustment of his cuffs, Raphael Neri looked, briefly, like someone who had encountered the one situation for which none of his preparation was relevant. I spent 3 weeks looking for a more complicated explanation, he said. There isn't one. She said nothing. She had learned from months of watching him that he was capable of extraordinary patience in every area except this one. She let him find his way to it. I kept coming back, he said. After Ghost didn't need to. I knew it. I was aware of it. Something in his jaw tightened slightly. I've been using my cat as a reason to be in this room, and I want you to know that I know how that sounds. Bex pressed her lips together. Don't, he said. I'm not saying anything. You're thinking very loudly. That's your line, she said. And then, I knew you knew. I was waiting to see how long it took you to stop pretending otherwise. Something shifted in him, not dramatically. Raphael Neri did not deal in dramatics, but the fraction of control he held every moment of every day became, for a moment, unnecessary. Like a muscle that had been braced so long it had forgotten what resting felt like. I want to take you to dinner, he said. She tilted her head. That sounded like a statement. He looked at her. She waited. The man who had once managed a negotiation involving a city councilman, a federal judge, and 2 rival families in the same conversation, without raising his voice, without revealing a single card, took a breath. Bex Harrington, he said. Would you have dinner with me? Not a question the first time. The second time, with the slight shift in his voice that she'd learned to read. It was. She looked at the spreadsheet on her monitor. Column F. She'd fixed the duplication 2 months ago after a man who had no reason to be reading her screen pointed it out without drawing attention to the fact that he'd been reading it. He had always seen exactly what was there. Yes, she said. The breath he let out was barely audible. She heard it anyway. 4 months later, Ghost walked into Aurelio's back office with the unhurried authority of someone returning to a space she'd already decided was hers. She stepped over Bex's shoe, settled beside the chair, and began cleaning her tail. Neri stood in the doorway. Some things had changed. Thursday evenings now belonged to the 2 of them, somewhere that was never Aurelio's, because Bex had been direct. What they were building and where she worked were two separate things, and she intended to keep them that way. He hadn't argued. He had learned, carefully, with the same attention he applied to everything that mattered to him. That Bex Harrington's sense of what belonged to her was more reliable than most people's sense of anything. Some things hadn't changed. Her name was still her own. The community kitchen was running its second year. The monitor still glowed at 11 p.m. What had changed? She had stopped making herself small. Neri thought he understood why. Now, she'd spent years perfecting smallness, because the world she moved in had made it feel like the safest shape. She'd been wrong about that, and she'd figured it out herself, and Ghost had probably known before either of them had. Cal Sullivan appeared in the doorway with 2 coffees. Ghost stood immediately, accepted a chin scratch with moderate enthusiasm, and returned to Bex's side. Neri looked at the 2 coffees. Bex pointed at him. "Don't." "I haven't said anything." "You were about to." "I was going to ask why there are 2. "Because there are always 2. Cal always brings 2. We have had this conversation 3 times. She handed him one. "Here." He took it. His gaze still moved between Cal and the coffees, with the patient expression of a man conducting a strategic assessment of a situation that did not require one. Bex watched him. She was becoming fluent in the particular language of Raphael Neri, trying not to be obvious about something. It was one of her favorite things about him, which she had not yet told him, and which she planned to deploy at a moment of her own choosing. Ghost pressed against her leg, circled once, and went to sleep. Neri looked at the cat, at Bex, at the window, at the coffee in his hand. The first night Ghost had walked 6 blocks through a cold city and climbed onto a stranger's lap. He had assumed something had gone wrong. His precisely calibrated animal, impeccably trained, had made an incomprehensible choice. Nothing had gone wrong. Ghost had found somewhere warm, and someone who looked at her without wanting anything in return, and had made the only sensible decision available to her. Neri had taken considerably longer to arrive at the same conclusion, but then Ghost had always been the smarter of the 2. He pulled the other chair around to her side of the desk, sat down, and stayed.